It's contract.
Then it will be a lease. There is no question around
It's
that.
contract.
If contractual, then contract says 11 months.
Contract says 11. It's practically happens.
Okay, like for example, in the UAE,
No renewal option? With no explicit renewal
It
option?
says that if the parties want to renew the contract, they can renew after the expiry of 11 months with the increase of 8% or 10%.
So the standard says that if there is a renewal option, then you will have to include the expected period into the lease terms for the purpose of IFRS 16.
correct, but
Calculate the right of use now.
correct, but the standard also says if both parties have a right to break.
Then it is then the lease is not accounted for under IFRS.
Well, but it's a short-term lease.
Yes.
See what happens in the United States, this doesn't exist. In the United States, what usually happens is the tenant has an option to renew, and the landlord has to say yes. That's how it usually works in the U.S. or in Western Europe. So most of the leases that I have seen are the tenant can say yes or no, and if the tenant says yes, the landlord must say yes. Therefore, that would be a long-term lease. But if it's genuine that both parties can walk away, in the UAE, they have a short-term lease, but the legal system there is such that the tenant legally has a right to stay with the new rent. Under the laws of the UAE, for commercial property, you can't just kick someone out, irrespective of what the contract says. So there, it gets it more interesting because the tenant has a right to stay, irrespective if the paper says it's a one-year lease.
Here as well, we can go to the court and we can extend the contract. We also have the possibility to go to the authorities and to extend the contract, because here as well it happens that when like 11 months, after 11 months there is a negotiation and the negotiation don't happen. Like if there is an argument, that people go to the court and the lease extends for the term until the court decides.
In that case, owner does not have the cancellation right.
Correct. So my issue is what you're describing to me. I mean, as a bank, you wouldn't make a big investment if the landlord could just kick you out. There must be something there.
Or we can say
There is nothing. You have the right to go to the court, but as per contract, you have a 11 months contract. And in court also, it's more likely that it will be the favor of the landlord. Because contractually it has been agreed.
Well, in IFRS 16, I didn't say it's based on contractual rights, which includes law. So the contractual rights is not just that only piece of paper, it's the legal framework in which you operate in.
The contract that has been drawn up is within the legal framework. It's not outside the legal framework. So the court might offer a sort of
A remedy or not.
but ultimately the landlord will prevail over there.
First, I think first we have to see the basic principle. On substance, it's a long-term lease. Before going into the specific standards, first we have to look at the basic principles of accounting.
Correct. Is there a long-term lease?
Yeah, it's a long-term lease.
Yes, but what the standard is trying to say is when you have a genuine long-term lease, you need to book the entire liability. And what they were trying to stop companies from doing is having a short-term lease contract with renewal options. So what the standard says, if there are renewal options, they're basically embedded into the fact that you include those in the lease term. And then you get these issues in countries where the tenant can stay as long as they want. So I guess if you think about this from the company's point of view, the purpose of this standard is saying if things go bad, what is the company locked into paying? So if you're telling me the company, if things go bad and the company can walk every year, then the lease term would be every year, right? And then it talks about the optional renewal periods, and it talks about the economic incentive. So this is actually a more interesting question. So you have 11 months contracts. There's no written renewal option.
Contract can be renewed
For how many years?
Of both.
That's 11 months.
11 months.
For only, so the renewal option is only for one more year. And after that, there's no renewal option.
Well, annually based on consent of both parties. So every year you have to renew. After every 11 months you have to renew.
So the current contract has one renewal option in it, that's it, right?
11 months.
In some cases, there's an understanding.
A right decision for the business to move its premise
Correct.
one to another, and like maybe it is discussed in the context of long-term leases, but it is there. Like I believe it's
Correct, it is there, yes.
So if even if it is 11 months, and then we know that we are going to conduct our business from the same stage, it is supposed to be.
Well, if you just take a step back, okay, because the problem is the standards were written by people in the UK and that have a different mindset, okay? So when I have these questions, I always go back to the mindset of how things work in the UK or in that part of the world, because that's how they wrote these. So the way it works there normally is you sign a lease for 5 years. You have an option to extend for 5 years. After that period of 10 years, you may want to extend further, but if it's not in the contract, the maximum lease term in IFRS 16 is 10 years. Even if economically you want to extend it more. And the argument is, after 10 years, you go back for a genuine renegotiation, and the landlord might put the price up so much where you might say goodbye. Or the landlord might not put the price up and you stay. So the thought process in IFRS 16 is, when is there a genuine decision point? And if you have a 5-year lease with a 5-year renewal, and on day 1 you expect to renew it, the decision point is in year 10. And so you do not have the lease term longer than the next decision point that's not obvious from the beginning. And it's a decision point because the landlord might give you a bad price. The decision point in year 5 is not considered to be a substantive decision point. Why? Because you made substantial amounts of investments. It's not economically viable to leave in year 5. So this is the thought process I'm trying to go through. The way you're explaining it, I'm having trouble referencing it to these points. So when is the genuine decision point? Not the superficial decision point, but when is the genuine decision point? And the genuine decision point is when the landlord and you might not agree on the rent, and they put the rent up. And then the other aspect is, what is the contractual term and what are the renewal options? So what's messy here is the renewal options, because it's not explicit like we have in the UK environment. So the question is, what do you consider to be the renewal options? That's what's messy here, right? Yes. And what is a genuine decision point? And I'm having trouble getting a conclusion because I'm having trouble reaching that. So what I would try to do to come to a conclusion is saying, okay, what is the practical decision points here? So if the way it works in Pakistan is that you can stay there and you can force it through court to stay there, and you make a lot of investment in the bank.
Yeah, like generally, like contracts that we have at our bank, it's one-sided. As you first explained, that lessee has the option to leave at any time.
But not the lessor.
Yeah. So
that's easy.
That's normally the practice. But then there could be.
So this bank is, you're the bank as well, right?
No. Sorry.
You're also a bank, correct?
So maybe then there are some contracts where that thing has not been considered, and then the lease has been signed. But generally, a bank would consider that nobody is kicking us out.
We should say that if IS is allowing us that if we are willing to take the risk that our owner can kick out us
then it's a short-term lease.
next year, then if we want to take this risk, then the IS allow us the benefit of not recording the liability. If we are willing to take this risk.
But I don't like that, the way you describe it, I don't like the way you're wording it, because the purpose of accounting is to show the risk and reality. And the reality is, if there's a genuine break point every year on both sides, it is a short-term lease, period. And if there is not a genuine break point from both sides every year, it is not a short-term lease. So the way you're describing it, it's clear to me. It's one-sided. That's not a short-term lease. You spent money, you're not going to move. I've never seen a situation where both have a genuine break point that you're describing, so it's messy for me. I have seen in the UAE where by law you're able to keep extending. And the question there that was posed is we do leasehold improvements. So we are a bank, we open up a branch in Dubai, we have a one-year contract, but by law the landlord has to give the current tenant a preemptive right, and the rents could only go up by an amount set by law. That's the UAE rules. So in UAE, if it's a commercial premise, the landlord can't kick you out unless there's certain criteria they met. They want to knock the building down and do something else. There's certain criteria, but generally they can't. So then the question I always get asked there is, I do leasehold improvements. The lease term is 2 years, but we expect to stay there for 10 years. What do we do with the leasehold improvements? And I always say, well, if you expect to be there for 10 years, I would do the leasehold improvements over 10 years. But as far as what the standard is trying to say here is, when are your genuine decision points? So generally, if you have a contract, it's the renewal periods. If the law says you can keep renewing indefinitely and the rent's going up, I haven't any cases to deal with that one. That's a tough one.
No, but in this example, if both the parties have
It's a short-term lease.
Yeah. But we have a pre-agreed rate of increase, let's say 10%, and we know that maybe for next 2 years, the rents are not going to rise above that. So we know that both the parties will continue for at least 2 years, like 11 months and then again 11 months. So we can call that a long-term lease, because it's not a short-term lease.
If it is cancelable, then irrespective of what period it has been made, it could always be a short-term.
Correct.
No, but he said it depends upon when the actual decision would be taken.
If it is cancelable, then decision can be made at any point.
Well, my point is, the idea behind IFRS 16 is the decision point. So from the UK context, the decision point on a 5-year lease with a 5-year renewal is usually at year 10, because on day 1, you run the numbers, you make a lot of leasehold improvements, you're going to renew it anyway. So usually you would say the major decision point is year 10. That's the lease term.
That is what I'm saying, that we know that for next 2 years the rents are not going to increase by any percentage above 10%. So we know that both the parties will continue for at least next
Correct.
2 years.
But the fact that the landlord and the tenant can both make a decision, decide to leave, that's a short-term lease by definition. So,
Come to the main question again, whether they have to look at the contract or the substance.
well, it's the legal framework. It's not just the contract, it's the laws of the country as well.
Yeah, I give another example that we have practically seen. It's a long-term lease of 3 years, but both parties have an option to leave with a 2 months notice. So to start with,
That's a short-term lease.
Exactly, because it's cancelable
Yeah.
at any given point in time. But on paper, it's like long-term lease already.
Well, both parties.
Both parties. Yeah, generally that's missing. Both parties is missing kind of a thing. When it comes to business, only one has.
Usually what I do is one-sided.
That's why employment contracts are not recorded as leases.
Both the parties.
What?
That's why employment contracts are not recorded as leases.
That's an IP. So the conclusion is, if you generally have a right to cancel on both sides,